weep. In this particular instance, the scripture just simply says in this translation, Jesus wept. Martha, of course, in this story here, was the first one to come to Jesus as he approached the home of Lazarus. And she met him out on the road, just prior to the home. And the first thing that she said, "Oh Lord, if you would have only been here, my brother would not have died." Mary, of course, was the second one that came to Jesus in that story. For she had been staying in the house with some of the Jews that had gathered with her in mourning the passing of Lazarus who had died. And so when she came to Jesus, along with those certain Jews, that followed her, Mary said the same thing to Jesus. "Lord, if you would have only been here, my brother would not have died." I wonder, and that's when Jesus wept. He saw all of them. He saw Mary weeping. He saw some of the Jews that had came with her weeping. And then this verse says, Jesus wept. Now I looked in the New Living Translation to see exactly how they had worded it. And it's almost the same, except it says, then Jesus wept. Signifying at that particular time is when Jesus began to cry, to shed tears. And I thought, well, why was Jesus crying here? Why was he weeping? There's a verse in the Bible in Psalms, the 12th chapter, in verse 15 that says, "Rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep." Why do we go to a funeral service when someone has died? A lot of cases it might be a loved one, but in some it's just a friend or a neighbor, that we know, an acquaintance that we might know. We go to rejoice with them. Do we go to weep with them in their moment of sorrow? Well, I think in this particular scripture, we can see that Jesus, we know from reading it that Jesus loved Lazarus very much. And that is what is shown here, that Jesus loved Lazarus. And you know what? He loves us too. I think that Martha and Mary both knew that Jesus loved Lazarus and that he was there even though he was late getting there. In fact, the scripture even talks about, he said, Lazarus will live. And Martha said, well, Lord, I know he'll live at the resurrection. But Jesus said, I am the resurrection. Jesus knew that Lazarus would live again. I think Martha and Mary both knew that also. But they were weeping along with the Jews because they had lost a loved one. And that's usually what we do when we lose a loved one. Is some of us who know that that loved one was a saved Christian and has went on to meet the Lord, our tears may be tears of joy, but there may be tears that we shed. We do not like to see a loved one leave us and go on to a better life. And so our tears may be tears of rejoicing rather than tears of weeping. Now, I'm not going to say that Martha and Mary's tears were tears of sadness and weeping, but maybe some of the Jews were weeping just to be weeping. But why did Jesus weep here? He knew. He knew Lazarus was going to rise. He knew about the resurrection of those loved ones that has gone on. He knew about all of those Jews that would not be there when the resurrection time comes. But I think all of this in this story is told to show the love of the Lord for his people. Do we feel that love? Do we recognize and know how much Jesus loved us? Loves us? What about today? This scripture kind of lends the light that Jesus not only was weeping because Mary and some of the Jews were weeping, but he was weeping for those Jews that were not there and not weeping. Those who were indifferent, those who were cold and lost, those who were trying to trick him into making some kind of statement or to do something that was wrong that they could crucify him. Jesus was weeping for them. Weeping for their not understanding and not accepting or not following him. Is Jesus weeping today? For we know that he sits at the right hand of God, interceding for you and I, and all of those out there that are not committing their way to the Lord. I want you to turn to Luke, the 19th chapter, because this has some very good information and goes along the same line. Here, Jesus weeps for Jerusalem. Just like Jesus is weeping for the world around us today.